Hello, eighth graders. We're reading the lottery. So pages 140 to 141 to be exact. We are doing the read for the key idea. So let me share my screen with you just to make sure all the directions are clear. Of course, we already went over the learning targets. You should have already seen the learning targets at the beginning. And we're analyzing character, okay? And more specifically, they have us focus in on Mr. Summers, and then at the end, Jack and Mr. Adams. Okay, so you have your do now. So we cruise down, we're at this part. So as you listen, think about the key idea question on page 141. And then, of course, be prepared to answer that. So what happens in this section of the story? Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and start reading. So have your books open, of course, to pages 140 to 141. That would be absolutely wonderful. And follow along with me. Now, if you need to, go ahead and mark your story, okay? Mark your pages here. So if anything helps you with putting down what happens in this section of the story, I'll go ahead and highlight it or mark it with your pencil somehow. Okay, so 140. Well, now, Mr. Summers said soberly, guess we better get started, get this over with. So as we can go, I should say that soberly. Well, now, Mr. Summers said soberly, guess we better get started, get this over with, so as we can go back to work. Anybody ain't here? Several people said, Dunbar. Mr. Summers consulted his list. Clyde Dunbar, he said. That's right. He's broke his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him? Me, I guess, a woman said. And Mr. Summers turned to look at her. Wife draws for husband, Mr. Summers said. Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie? Although Mr. Summers and everybody else in the village knew the answer perfectly well. It was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. Horace is not but 16 yet, Mrs. Dunbar said regretfully. Guess I got to fill in for the old man this year. Right, Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, Watson boy drawing this year? A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. Here, he said. I'm drawing for mother and me. He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, Good fellow, Jack. Glad to see your mother's got a man to do it. Well, Mr. Summers said, guess that's everyone. Old man Warder make it? Here, a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. All ready, he called. Now I'll read the names, heads of families first, and men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everybody has had a turn. Everything clear? The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, Adams? A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. Hi, Steve, Mr. Summers said. And Mr. Adams said, Hi, Joe. They grinned at one another humorously and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. Alan, Mr. Summers said. Anderson, Betham. Now, before I stop recording and have you write that down, some people were confused about heads of household. It's similar to, I guess, a classroom. Like for me, I'm kind of the head of the classroom. I'm sort of, coordinate things and this and that. And back in where this story takes place, the head of the household was a male figure. So a lot of people were confused by that. This is kind of the time period. So what they're doing is they're narrowing it down. So everybody picks it, and the head of the household pick the one paper, and then you'll see on the next pages, whichever house or whoever's in a house, they have to redraw. Okay, so they're kind of narrowing it down at this point. Okay, so that's why only one person from a family is drawing. Okay, let me stop sharing.